Hello, Dr. Roberts. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. Dr. Roberts, you were previously the China bureau chief and Asian news editor at Bloomberg Businessweek. You're a celebrated journalist on China, and you were based in Beijing for more than 2 decades. You have reported from all over China's provinces, and including Tibet and Xinjiang. You have covered a diverse range of issues, including companies, entrepreneurs, migrants, civil society, etc. So first, can you please tell us a little bit about how you got started on your journalist career and why did you choose China as your main area of focus?
Oh, that's a long story, and it goes back a long time. I growing up in Montana, in the western part of the United States, far from the ocean and far from Asia. I guess it's surprising that I did have this interest in China, but I really picked it up from my father, who was, for a variety of reasons, very interested in Asian culture and also in Chinese philosophy. He gave me a book of an introduction to Chinese philosophy in English. I wasn't reading Chinese back then. I think right before I started high school, or as I started high school, and so I had this interest. Although, as I said, I was far from China. When I started at university in California, I actually pretty quickly started studying Mandarin Chinese, took another introduction to Chinese philosophy class, and then focused really on political science and the contemporary history and politics of China. So I had that interest and started studying in college, and then moving on, right after graduation went on to Taiwan, which at that point, that was long enough ago that it was probably the most common place for students in the United States that had studied Chinese to go study. And so I went there rather than to Beijing or Shanghai. And then quite a few years later, made my way to Beijing.
You decided to leave China a short while ago. Can you please tell us a little bit about the thinking process behind that, if you don't mind?
I don't mind. So when I left China, which was in the summer of 2018, so we're actually getting close to 3 years this summer. I had then been living in China and working as a journalist for 23 years. And I loved it. To my mind, the most interesting story in the world to write about as a journalist and as a business journalist during those years was China. And as I mentioned earlier, I had this interest in China that preceded me getting into journalism. But after 23 years and for my family, including my daughter, who I was concerned about growing up in the pollution of Beijing, which was very bad then during those years, and just personally and professionally, having reported there for 23 years, I knew I could probably spend the rest of my life reporting from China. It would continue to be absolutely fascinating, but I decided that, for me, the 23 years was enough, and for those personal and family reasons, it was time to come back to the United States. Also,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. As you mentioned, you have followed China's economy and all aspects of China's society with on-the-ground reporting for 23 years. I mean, starting with China's accession to the WTO. And, when people outside of China talk about China's economy, a frequent complaint I hear is we don't really have good data. I mean, the government's data is kind of fishy. We don't know if we should trust it or not. So, for that reason, the outside world's assessment of China's economic strength seems to be extremely diverse. On one hand, we hear stories of China's imminent collapse. At the other extreme, we have, things like the Chinese miracle. China is going to eclipse the United States in the next 5 years, etc. So, based on your observation, how is China's economy actually doing at this point, and what are its strengths and weaknesses, so to speak?
That's a good question. So the strengths are obvious, and China is a massive continental economy, like the United States, a continental economy with large, thriving regional markets across China. It has obviously relatively, with some shortcomings regionally, a well-educated population, a ecosphere of very entrepreneurial people who have started companies. It's very competitive, so that when a company starts, it needs to quickly up its game, or it's not going to survive. And that can be tough, but it also means that the companies that survive do tend to be quite strong. Today we've got, today it's, I think around more than 70% in terms of GDP, more than 70% of the United States GDP. According to many estimates, within a number of just a few years, it could eclipse the United States as the world's largest country by GDP. So these are all real successes. I mean, we've got more Chinese companies in the Fortune Global 500 now, just slightly more Chinese companies than actually American companies, which is another milestone. Those are all quite positive. Another thing I would say that is positive, well, first I'll say it's positive, is the fact that you have a motivated and effective government infrastructure and system that is dedicated to trying to grow the economy. That's a strength. That also happens to be a weakness, that you have such a motivated and effective government that is trying to manage the economy. And that brings us into the weaknesses. One of the serious offshoots of that strong government presence is a real focus on growth at all costs. Often the easiest way to make sure the economy, GDP grows at high levels is to pump money in. We have an excessive reliance on investment in China, and associated with that on debt to grow the economy. So by most estimates now, total debt amounts to more than 300% of GDP today. And that is seen by many economists as potentially destabilizing, and the debt is growing too rapidly. The flip side of that is you still have a relatively weak consumer economy. People hear that and they think, are you crazy? I mean, China is the world's largest consumer market, and it is a big and thriving consumer market. However, if you look at consumption, domestic consumption or household consumption as a proportion of GDP, it's still just around a third, 34% or so. And that's actually, if you compare it to other countries in the world, very low and unusually low for a country that is growing as fast as China. And so that's a problem. The Chinese leadership knows they want to transition away from this reliance on investment and on debt towards a more consumption-driven economy, but they're making very slow progress on that.
I see. And that's sort of the central theme, one of the central themes of your book, A Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And I just heard there's a Chinese version of the book coming out, so we'll make sure to include a link to both the English version and the Chinese version, so our readers and audience can take a look. So, as you briefly...
Yesterday, actually, I'm pleased to say, yes.
Congratulations. So I think you alluded to this issue. The leadership sort of realized there's an issue there. Investment-driven growth model is not sustainable. You quickly run into the region of diminishing return. So that's clear. But how much political will does Xi Jinping have to redistribute the fruits of China's growth to the middle class into the private sector economy?
Well, I think the motivation is very high. And this has been a stated goal of the government, at least going back until an important party third plenum in 2013. So there's this real awareness that they do need to make that transition away from investment-led, debt-led, and away from being so export-focused as well. If you see, just take one very important policy for Xi Jinping himself, General Secretary Xi Jinping, the elimination of extreme poverty. China, as not everyone realizes, has a deeply unequal society today, with huge gaps between the very wealthy and the very poor. So one of the things that Xi Jinping has done is put an emphasis and created this enormous campaign to try to end extreme poverty. Well, they announced very recently, as you know, in the last month or so, that they had actually succeeded. And this is a tremendous achievement to end extreme poverty, which is pretty, there still are a lot of poor people, but extreme poverty is ended. And that is necessary in order to start to make a transition to a more consumption-driven economy. So I think that there's a political will behind this transition, but there's also really substantial political obstacles that they are not really addressing. And one of the main issues in my book is looking at what I call these legacy policies, legacy because they date back to the Mao era, long before Xi was even around, Xi Jinping was around. And in particular, I look at the household registration or the hukou policy, and also the dual land policy. And both of those have the effect of constraining consumption by as much as half of China's people. So you see, broad brush, you see a lot of urban markets, particularly along the coast in the wealthier parts of China, that have vibrant consumer markets, lots of spending by Chinese consumers. And you see something very different when you go into the interior and look at people from rural China, including the several 100 million migrant workers of China.
I see. And next, I wanted to turn to China's relation with the world. As you know, in the United States, we seem to be facing this pressing issue of how to compete with and push back against China's powerful and disruptive system of state capitalism. So tell us a little more about state capitalism. What are the main features of this idea of Chinese state capitalism? And why do we or politicians think they pose threats to the United States' economic and strategic interests?
So I think, first of all, it's fair to say that under General Secretary Xi Jinping, we've seen a growing emphasis on state capitalism, and sort of a step backwards from our perspective, meaning the United States, sort of this idea that China was on a path towards economic opening and reform, starting back with its entry to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Well, the reality is, over the years, certainly since Xi Jinping took power, we've seen a retrenching of the state sector and a move back towards more state capitalism. Some of the key elements, of course, are go back the things that Mao learned from Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, 5-year plans, which are still alive and kicking in China today. So plans that lay out broad goals of how industries should develop and how the economy should develop. Also social goals on how people's income should grow and so on are very much in use today. They set targets usually in Beijing that then are implemented or aimed for in provinces across China. And this really does affect policymaking. You have a tendency where regional governments, provincial governments, big city governments around China feel like they need to meet certain goals that have been set in Beijing. And often that involves the most raw goal is reaching a certain GDP growth level. And that actually becomes a problem with the need to do that, meaning that they need to focus on investment and on debt in many cases. So that's one key area. Another key area is a state-directed lending system where in many cases the different state entities are deciding which companies or which industries will get access to loans through the banking system, which is still state-run. The government has talked for years about moving away from that, trying to emphasize lending to small and medium enterprises, to private enterprises more. But the reality is, in many cases, the big state banks are lending to, in most cases, are lending to the big state enterprises. And so that's another key facet of it. I would say another is the use of sometimes murky trade barriers and investment barriers that ensure that those companies or those industries that the government has decided should succeed do well to the detriment of either private companies in China in some cases, or often to foreign investors. So basically, this could be hidden subsidies, low costs or free access to land, to water, to energy. Often it's also controls over who gets access to a market, either through government procurement, where the government decides what's going to be bought, or through permitting. So a company may discover that it can't sell its products simply because it doesn't have the proper permits from the government to do so. In many cases, that is sort of a hidden form of state capitalism, which aims to benefit certain companies and industries.
I see. And on your last point, as you also mentioned in your book, this issue of intellectual property theft, lack of market access, and state-directed investment in China, I think it's pretty clear that these are long existing problems. These are not recent problems. And they exist in China even when China was much weaker, economically speaking. But it seems like it is now that these issues start to seem urgent, especially in U.S. policymaking circles.
Well, I would actually say that they were called out early on and repeatedly. I mean, when I moved to Beijing in 1995 and immediately started. I was working then for Businessweek magazine. It hadn't become part of Bloomberg at that point. Our focus was looking at often at the prospects of foreign investors and particularly American companies in China. And immediately the topics that I learned that I needed to focus on were looking at intellectual property rights and the lack of protections in China, looking at subsidies that were favoring Chinese industry over the foreign investors, and looking at things like either forced or coercive technology transfer agreements. So if a company wanted to set up in China, a foreign company, they would be, as part of that, the terms of them getting permission to set up in China, they would have to promise to share the technology of their business, whatever it might be, with a Chinese partner in many cases. And so those were issues that I was writing about in the late 90s, right up until when China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. And the World Trade Organization included extensive commitments, market opening commitments on both sides, particularly on the Chinese side, pledges to slash tariffs, pledges to end subsidies of different industries, promises to stop requirements that had forced foreign investors to always have a Chinese joint venture partner before they started a business. All of those things were what I was writing about back then. Interestingly, when I jumped forward until 2018 or whatever, the last couple of years with the Trump trade war, those exact same issues were the same issues we are hearing about again. So, more than 2 decades later, those issues are unresolved. And in some cases, I think with the slide back into more state capitalism in China, they're even becoming more of an issue for foreign investors in China today. One number I would just note, in the year 2000, China's GDP was just a little over 10% the size of the US GDP, 11% something. Now it's, as I said earlier, over 70%. It's on track, most economists believe, to surpassing the US as the world's largest GDP. So although those issues are the same issues as back then, I would say that they have a greater urgency given the degree to which China has become so much more economically powerful, and countries around the world, including the US, have become so much more closely linked economically to China today.
I see. And speaking of the United States' strategy to deal with China, as you mentioned, during the Trump era, we started this trade war against China. And at that time, the trade war was marketed as a way to sort of pressure China onto market-oriented reforms, quoting Ambassador Lighthizer. So, looking back, do you think the trade war was the right way to go? And what do you think are the key ingredients of a successful China strategy from the United States point of view?
Well, I guess, first of all, I would have to give Lighthizer and the Trump administration credit for an overdue recognition of the fact that the U.S.-China economic and trade relationship needed fixing. And that, like I said, those same issues that were bedeviling foreign investors and American investors in China in the 1990s are still with us today. So they were not solved. WTO, entry into the World Trade Organization, did not fix all those problems by any means. So give credit where it's due. Having said that, I do think that the form that this has been waged in, a trade war with tariffs, retaliatory tariffs slapped on each other's products, is not particularly helpful. And if we look at actually some of the goals that were laid out helpfully by the Trump administration in terms of sales of energy products, agricultural products, and other products, we'll see that actually the targets were not even remotely close to being met. Part of that, of course, has to do with the global downturn with the pandemic, but also more than that, it was because China has not responded in the way that we were told that they would when we slapped all these tariffs on them, and they have not agreed or opened up their markets to the degree that some people hoped. So I think that has not worked. I think the most serious mistake of the Trump administration was this go it alone approach, this idea that we could fight it out with China while simultaneously alienating many of our allies that actually share many of the same concerns about the mercantilist practices of China. So it's not news to you that relations with Europe suffered a lot under the Trump administration. The failure to enter the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which has been resurrected in a new form now, but without the United States, I think was a huge blow to us having a healthier economic relationship with China. And I think also we saw our Asian allies as well, the American Asian allies, not treated particularly well either. And so one of the things I have some hope about is the fact that the Biden administration has been so open about the need to try to rebuild these alliances. If you look at what the Biden administration has done vis-a-vis China, it seems to be quite similar to the Trump administration in terms of you can almost call it a hardline approach to China to try to get them to change. The tariffs have not been lifted. But at the same time, there has been this effort to try to rebuild relationships with our allies. I happen to think that is extremely important to having a healthier relationship with China. We share common interests, as I said earlier, with Europe about seeing China end some of these mercantilist practices that are seen as not fair to our companies. We, standing together, a unified stance, I think there's much more likelihood that we could actually see the U.S.-China relationship, China's relationship with the world change in a way that the rest of the world would like it to change.
I see. And since we're talking about U.S.-China relations, there's one specific area super toxic I think we have to touch upon, which is the origin of the coronavirus. We saw the WHO report, which many found to be unsatisfactory, about this, the possibility of a lab leak, right? And you talked with Matt Pottinger. I also listened to that webinar. I guess what's really striking is how different people's views are on this matter, right? So when we hear not just from people like Pompeo, but also from Matt Pottinger, from Dr. Redfield, on the possibility of a lab leak theory. But when we talk to people from the science community, the consensus still seems to be, it's a natural origin. So why are people's assessments on this issue so different? Are the politicians just pushing their agenda? Do they just don't understand science? Are the scientists just too naive to understand what's going on in China? From a journalist point of view, what's your baseline assessment here?
Well, I would note that I think it was just yesterday that the head of the WHO, Tedros, said himself that that his organization, working with the Chinese, had not adequately gotten to the bottom of the question of whether there was possibly a lab leak. He didn't say that he thought that there was, but he said we haven't properly investigated that. I think that was very significant. I don't know how they came to the decision that they needed to say that, but that's a big step in a different direction for the WHO, and a big step in the saying that this is a possibility. The door is not closed to that possibility. I think that as Matt Pottinger said when I spoke to him, the reality is lab leaks are very common. They happen all over the world. They've happened in China before with SARS in Beijing. They've happened across the United States. This seeming sort of unified stance by the scientific community, I shouldn't say unified, but in many cases, this sort of, this consolidated, somewhat unified stance that no, there was no lab leak, I think is misguided. I think that, in the spirit of scientific inquiry, and most importantly, getting to the bottom of a pandemic that has killed people all around the world, and putting us in a place where we can prevent it to the best of our ability from happening again, we need to explore all possibilities very, very carefully. It's entirely possible that it was a lab leak. Almost certainly would be unintentional, obviously. It could have also, been not a lab leak, but we don't know at this point. And the main reason we don't know is because the Chinese authorities have done their best to make sure that we don't know. And I think that's a huge problem. Again, you look at the scale of devastation wrought globally by this pandemic to economies, people dying, people sick. I think every country owes it to every other country to open up and have a really fair, open, honest reckoning about how this actually happened. And that's just simply not what's happening right now. Why the scientific community has been, to a large degree, so unwilling to touch that or consider that issue, I can't pretend that I know. I would note that if we were to discover down the road that it had been a lab leak, this would have global implications for labs around the world, not just in China. This would be tremendously disruptive to how these labs are managed, and in a good way, because they need to, if indeed it was a lab leak, we do need to we need to look at safety practices around the world, not just in China, on labs, look at the sort of the different kinds of scientific inquiry and testing that they're doing, examine that, and again, look to make sure that this is done in a safe way going forward. So I do think it's easier for everybody, including the scientific community, if we can assume that this was not a lab leak and that it was something else.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you so much for all your insights. This has been a super fun conversation. So we'll make sure to include links to your book in the show notes section for our audience to take a look. Thank you so much, Mr. Roberts. Thank you for this conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Awesome. Bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.